Hello everyone and welcome to another video. I have been living in a Tokyo Microapartment for an entire year now. This apartment is 21 square meters. It is a very small apartment. By Australian standards, this is absolutely tiny. I love this apartment, I love it very much, but there are still some challenges that come with living in such a tiny space, especially when you're from a country where that isn't the norm. So today I thought I might share some of my wisdom and coping mechanisms and advice for living in such a small space and still enjoying it. And yeah, this is my experiences of spending an entire year living in a Tokyo microapartment. First, I think it starts with expectation and experience. If you're from a country or a city that has really big houses and everyone is used to living in houses and not apartments in really big spaces, it's going to be more difficult for you to adjust to living in a micro apartment. So yeah, essentially the point I'm getting at is if you're used to only big houses, if you're used to only having wide space where you can speak very loudly and dance around and do all the things, it's going to be more difficult for you to adjust. Just keep that in mind is basically the only advice I can give. Obviously you can't just go and change all your life experiences on a whim, but be mindful that it might be difficult for you, that it might take some adjusting for you to get used to living in a micro apartment. But yeah, I have never felt trapped in this apartment. I have never felt claustrophobic. I've never felt like I couldn't breathe. I've never felt like it was terribly small. But yeah, things get frustrating about this apartment that have nothing to do with its size. My biggest pet peeve with living here is the fact that the building is a wooden building, which means that there is no insulation at all. I can hear everything my neighbors are doing at any given point. If my neighbors are having like an argument, or if they are like walking up their stairs too heavily, or if they shut something really loudly, I can hear everything. I have this tiny tub of moisturizer, the one that's from Claire's that I showed you guys, and it's like 90 ml and it was half full, so it wasn't even that heavy, and I dropped it. I dropped it like on the shelf. It was a tiny fall, and because it was like 11 o'clock at night or something, my neighbor just smacked on the wall. And it wasn't even talking or anything. I just accidentally dropped something. I had a moment of clumsiness. I got told off for it, and to have that is not very comfortable in your space. In your space, you should be comfortable to be able to walk around your apartment or pick up a bottle of moisturizer. But it's just the nature of having thin walls, and it's something you have to deal with. The other pet peeve I have in this apartment that makes it more difficult is because it is so small and it is a lofted space, we sleep on futons. Now, there's nothing wrong with sleeping on a futon. Many people do it here. But the futons that we have are like ridiculously thin. They look really cozy. If you see the clip that I put in from my apartment tour, like it looks like a really nice space, like you're sleeping in a treehouse, but they are so thin. Like if I'm like sleeping on my side, my hip is touching the floor, and it's like not the greatest. We could have invested in more expensive ones, but we were never really in that position to commit to that, so we just dealt with these ones. If we had a bigger apartment, we'd probably have a proper bed. We probably would have been given a proper bed. So that was one of the trade-offs that we had, is that we picked a lofted space, which I liked, but I don't like the futons. They make my back sore and they make me feel like I'm like 90 years old. So yeah, those are the biggest pet peeves and difficulties for me about living in this particular apartment, and they're not entirely related to size. As far as coping mechanisms go, I'm now going to share with you my tips for dealing with living in a small space. As I've said again and again, I like living here. I have not struggled with living here, though there's obviously been things that have been annoying. If there comes a day where I am feeling a bit suffocated by how small it is, if I am feeling like it's too little, I go outside. I just go for a walk, and I think that's really important if you live in a small space. If you live in a space that's smaller than this, I've been quite fortunate with this apartment because there's a lot of natural light, and I very much need that. Like I get a bit like sad if I'm in a place that has like no light. But yeah, I just go for a walk. I go outside, I go remind myself that I'm living in Japan and it's a beautiful place, and that's essentially my most important coping mechanism for living in such a small space. Especially if you're living in a small space with your partner, it's important that you guys like get outside and go enjoy the world, and essentially just don't be cooped up too much. So yeah, if I'm ever feeling a bit closed in, a bit claustrophobic, I just go outside and go for a walk. I open up a window, I open up my curtains, I let the world in. I just remember that even though this space is really, really small, I can just go outside and that's totally fine. Another tip is be careful with what you buy. This seems really, really logical, but I've seen a lot of apartment tours with people with very, very tiny apartments, and there's just too much stuff in the apartment. I've made so many jokes about having to be a forced minimalist since living here, because living in a place temporarily or semi-temporarily and not really knowing where you're going to be means that you can't own a lot of stuff. But obviously, if you have a small space, the more things you buy, the more cramped it's going to feel. If you have like a million knickknacks, or if you just have like shelf after shelf after shelf of like stuff that you don't need, it's going to feel absolutely tiny. Buy things intelligently, have really, really good creative storage solutions. Make sure that you are being careful with the way you store things so that it doesn't get cluttered, because clutter will make it feel a lot smaller than it is. Next one is clean often. This is not something I even realized until I lived in a teeny tiny space, but if you are one person or if you're living with your partner or whatever, you guys are going to have the same amount of dirt that you track into the house. Like, there's going to be the same amount of like mess and stuff, even though the space is smaller. So it's going to feel like your apartment gets dirtier a lot quicker because there's so much less floor space. It's good because you can clean your apartment really quickly. Like, this apartment takes like 5 minutes to vacuum. It's not much, but you have to do it more regularly because of like the space is smaller. It seems like there's more dirt. I think it can also be really important for mental health to be in a good clean space, so definitely make sure you try to clean a lot. Leave the house every day. I know this is the same as going for a walk when you feel like claustrophobic or anything, but just as a general rule of thumb, even if I don't feel like it, I make sure I leave the house every day. And if you're a student, or if you're a freelancer, if you work from home a lot, if you're in the house a lot and you have a tiny, tiny space, it is important to leave every single day because it's really good for your mental health. Even if you don't go and speak to anyone, it's really good to be around other human beings. Like, trust me, it's really good. And I noticed that if I don't leave the house every single day and go for a walk and get outside and go to the shops, it really affects me. And maybe if this apartment was bigger, maybe that would be okay. But I just know that, at least for me, it's very important to go outside every day, even if you don't have to. And yeah, I think those are most of my main tips. Basically, you just need to look after yourself and look after your space, keep your mental health in check, because as I've said over and over, I love this apartment. I adore it so much. It's like my favorite place I've ever lived, but living in a teeny tiny space can be a bit challenging at times. I do believe that we got exceptionally lucky with this apartment. Like, not only is it a beautiful space despite being small, it's also in the most perfect area. Like, it's in a really, really great area to live in. And honestly, that's the main thing that makes it good to live in this apartment, because I love where I live. As I've said, I've never been miserable in this apartment. I just think it's really important to take care of yourself and to keep your mental health in check. Leave the house every day, keep your apartment clean, don't clutter it too much, don't buy too many things, and honestly, you should be good. And overall, the most important thing to surviving a micro apartment is have a positive mindset. If I'm struggling, if I'm having a bad day, if I feel like this apartment's too small, I just remind myself where I am, why I'm here, why I'm living this apartment, and why I chose this apartment. As I said, beautiful apartment, it's very clean, it's very new, it's in a lovely place, and keeping that positivity, as like silly as that sounds, it's really, really important, and it's really, really helpful. Anyway, that was just a small bit of advice and some of my experiences about living in a micro apartment here in Tokyo. I hope you guys enjoyed the video and have a lovely day. Bye.